Sorry, ma'am. Your name is not on the list. The young guard's words drove straight through my ribs like a bayonet. Past the security fence, I saw my dad, Captain Arthur Nelson, basking in his retirement glory in his crisp uniform. His eyes met mine across the asphalt. One single heartbeat of silence passed. Then he flashed a smug, satisfied smirk, turned his back, and left his biological daughter standing on the curb like trash. I looked down, crushing the dropped event program I had found by the gate in my fist. His sharp, unmistakable handwriting bled through the paper. Cross Mary's name out, don't let her overshadow my son's glory. 15 years of bleeding in the shadows to keep thousands of sailors alive, only to be executed by my own father's pen. If he didn't need a daughter, I would walk in there as his absolute nightmare. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I was 17 years old when I understood exactly what I was worth to Captain Arthur Nelson. Not through a conversation, not through a letter, through a backyard barbecue that rewired the entire operating system of my brain. I stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand gripping the wooden frame so hard the grain bit into my fingers. The backyard was swarming with people. My dad had invited every neighbor on the block, plus half his retired unit. He rented a massive commercial grill that took up a quarter of the patio. Smoke rolled off the cast iron in thick gray clouds, carrying the heavy smell of sizzling burgers and hickory charcoal into the kitchen. Rock music blasted from a speaker propped against the fence, loud enough to rattle the kitchen windows. Red and blue streamers hung from the gutters. My dad had gone to the party supply store that morning and bought a banner that read, "Future Officer," in gold foil letters. He stapled it to the back fence himself. David stood in the center of the yard like a Roman emperor receiving tribute. He was 18, tan, broad-shouldered, grinning so wide you could count his molars. He had just received his acceptance letter to the Naval Academy. A basic acceptance. Thousands of kids got the same letter every year. My dad slapped David on the shoulder, handing him a beer even though he wasn't old enough to drink. Nobody said a word. My dad raised his own glass and launched into a speech retelling the story of David's admissions interview for the 4th time that afternoon. The way my dad told it, David had single-handedly impressed a panel of admirals with his leadership vision. The neighbors cheered. Beer cans popped and hissed across every folding table. Kids from the block ran through the sprinkler at the far end of the yard, screaming and laughing. The whole street had become a carnival for my brother's most basic achievement. I held my National Strategic Decoding Championship certificate against my chest. The heavy frame pressed into my sternum, the gold foil seal dug into my palm hard enough to leave an imprint. I had spent 11 months competing against 430 candidates from 17 states. I dismantled every opponent's algorithm. The judges' panel told me my solution was the most sophisticated submission they had reviewed in the competition's 12-year history. 3 universities had already sent scholarship inquiries to my school. I was 17 years old and I had outperformed graduate students. I stepped onto the patio. Nobody looked up. I walked straight to my dad, waiting for a break in his loud storytelling. He was mid-sentence, waving a greasy spatula around, splattering drops of fat onto the concrete. The neighbors laughed at something he said. I waited. He told another joke. I waited longer. Finally, he paused to take a drink. I stepped forward and held out the heavy framed certificate with both hands. He glanced down at it. He didn't even set his drink down. His eyes scanned the complex algorithm notations printed beneath the gold seal, and his jaw tightened. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't pride. It wasn't curiosity. It was irritation. The kind of irritation a man shows when someone interrupts his show. My dad shoved the frame back into my chest hard enough to push me backward half a step. He sneered, his lip curling over his teeth. "That's fine, Mary, but it won't get you a star on your shoulder boards." He turned his back before I could react, raising his glass toward David. The crowd erupted in another round of cheers. David caught my eye across the yard and lifted his beer in a lazy, mocking salute. A few of the neighbors followed David's gaze, saw me standing there with the frame pressed against my body, and turned back to the grill without a word. I did not cry. Crying was a surrender of tactical advantage. I learned that lesson in that exact moment, standing on that patio with burger smoke burning my eyes. I carried the frame back to my bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of my bed. I traced the edges of the wood with my thumb pressing hard enough to feel the grain. The roaring applause from the backyard filtered through the thin glass of my window. The bass from the speakers vibrated through my floor, a low, throbbing pulse that I could feel in my teeth. I sat there for 2 hours. I did not go back downstairs. I did not eat. I did not ask for a plate. That afternoon, I mapped out the psychological architecture of the Nelson family with the same precision I would later use to decode enemy communications. The hierarchy was simple. My father was the dictator. David was the heir. My mother was the enabler. And I was the inconvenience, the variable that threatened to disrupt the dynasty's narrative. They did not value intellect or sacrifice. They worshipped loud, empty bravado, the kind that looked good on a mantelpiece and sounded impressive at a dinner party. I took down every childhood poster from my bedroom walls. I pulled the tacks out one by one, letting the paper curl and fall to the floor. I replaced them with encrypted tactical maps I had printed at the public library on my own dime. I taped each one to the wall with military precision edges, aligned corners flat. From that afternoon forward, I stopped bringing my report cards downstairs. I stopped expecting acknowledgement. I stopped sitting at the dinner table when David held court bragging about his academy drills, while my mom refilled his plate and my dad clapped him on the shoulder. I ate alone in my room, studying satellite imagery and signals intelligence theory from textbooks I had requested through interlibrary loans. I built my own world inside those 4 walls, a world engineered for performance, stripped of sentiment, optimized for a single purpose, to become so powerful that their validation would be meaningless. I packed my bags in silence on my 18th birthday. 2 duffel bags. Everything I owned fit inside them. My mom stood at the end of the hallway in her bathrobe, wringing her hands in that slow, circular motion she always did when she wanted to appear distressed without actually doing anything. She offered a weak smile. Her eyes were red around the edges but dry. She did not step forward. She did not reach for me. She did not say, "Stay." She did not say, "I'm proud of you." She did not say, "I'm sorry your father is the way he is." She just stood there, a portrait of weaponized incompetence, choosing the comfort of her husband's shadow over protecting her own daughter. I walked past her. My shoulder brushed the wall. I opened the front door, stepped out into the cold morning air, and pulled it shut behind me without looking back. I drove to the enlistment office in my rusted Civic with the passenger window that didn't roll up. I signed my name on the dotted line before noon. I traded their worthless validation for absolute ruthless independence. The military did not care about the Nelson family hierarchy. It cared about what my brain could do when the stakes were measured in body bags. My hands flew across the mechanical keyboard, the heavy clack of the keys the only sound in the underground bunker. It was hour 34 of Operation Iron Shield. No windows, no natural light. Just the harsh blue glow of 6 tactical monitors arranged in a semicircle around my station, each one streaming threat data in real time. My eyes burned bloodshot and completely dry. I had stopped blinking without realizing it. A hostile state actor had penetrated the outer defense perimeter of a U.S. carrier strike group's communications network and was 3 firewalls away from total compromise. If those firewalls fell, 5,000 sailors on 3 ships would lose navigation, targeting, and communication systems simultaneously. They would be blind in hostile waters. I had a photo taped to the upper left corner of my center monitor. A young enlisted kid, maybe 19, standing on the flight deck of the USS Gerald Ford with his arm around his mother. He was grinning, squinting against the sun. She was crying. Somebody's son, somebody's reason to come home. I stared at that photo for half a second, then slammed the enter key, executing a countermeasure algorithm I had designed from scratch during a 48-hour coding sprint 3 months earlier. The red threat vectors on the main screen flatlined one by one, collapsing like dominoes. The network stabilized. The strike group's systems remained intact. 5,000 sailors continued breathing without ever knowing how close they came to going dark. I drank my cold, stale coffee, the grounds gritty against my teeth, and moved to the next terminal. Nobody called. Nobody sent flowers. Nobody threw a barbecue. 48 hours later, I sat at the Nelson family Thanksgiving table. I wore a plain gray sweater to cover the bruises from combat survival training. The welts across my shoulders and ribs throbbed under the wool every time I shifted in my chair. My hands were still sore from the keyboard marathon, the tendons in my wrists stiff and aching. David slammed his fist on the table hard enough to rattle the silverware, bragging about a routine supply drill he had run at the base. He described it like he had stormed a fortified position under enemy fire. My dad leaned forward, hanging on every word, his fork frozen in midair, his eyes gleaming with the same pride he had shown at the barbecue years earlier. Nothing had changed. David performed. My father applauded. The cycle was self-sustaining. My mom looked across the table at me. She slid a bowl of mashed potatoes across the wood, the ceramic scraping against the grain. She tilted her head and sighed, the kind of sigh that pretends to be sympathetic while delivering a surgical insult. "It's a shame you're stuck doing that boring desk clerk work, Mary. It must be so tedious." She shook her head gently, as if mourning my failure on my behalf. David snorted into his glass. My dad didn't even glance in my direction. I chewed my food in absolute silence. I calculated the exact trajectory of the knife they were twisting in my back, the angle, the depth, the rotation. I could have told them that 48 hours ago I had saved 5,000 lives from a windowless room 6,000 miles from this table. I could have told them that the coffee mug I drank from in that bunker had more combat significance than David's entire career. I said nothing. I washed my plate, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet. I drove back to base that night, doing 90 on the interstate, the windows down, letting the freezing November air numb my face and hands until my fingers could barely grip the steering wheel. 3 years later, I sat in a forward operating base. The walls were reinforced concrete and steel, the air thick with recycled oxygen, and the smell of electrical wiring. A Navy SEAL Element 12 men was pinned down behind enemy lines. Their primary communication satellite had been knocked offline. Their backup frequency was jammed. They were functionally invisible, and their extraction window was collapsing by the minute. The official channels were grinding through 3 layers of military bureaucracy, each layer requesting authorization from the layer above. By the time the paperwork cleared, those 12 men would be dead. I bypassed the chain of command. I manually hijacked a dormant satellite that had been decommissioned from active rotation 2 years earlier, locating its residual frequency, and forcing open a narrow corridor just wide enough to transmit coordinates. My fingers moved so fast across the keyboard that my nail caught on the edge of a key and tore. Blood smeared across the spacebar. Sweat ran down the back of my neck, soaking into my collar. I locked the extraction coordinates and transmitted them directly to the nearest air asset. 90 seconds. That was the margin. 12 men pulled out alive with less than 2 minutes to spare. I logged out of the terminal, leaving no trace of my clearance code. The official record would show that extraction was authorized through standard channels. My name appeared nowhere. I leaned back in my chair, pressed my palms flat against my eyes, and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to my own heartbeat slow down. A week later, an unmarked manila envelope slid under my office door. No return address. No official stamp. No postmark. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The paper was thick, the kind used for classified document wrappers. I tore it open. Inside was a single piece of heavily crinkled, blood-stained tactical paper. The stains were dark brown, oxidized, dried deep into the fibers in uneven blotches. It had been folded and refolded dozens of times, creased until the paper was soft as cloth. I unfolded it with the care of handling evidence. Heavy, rushed handwriting covered the center, the kind of penmanship produced by a hand that is shaking from adrenaline and cold. "We are alive because of you. A soldier never betrays their benefactor." No signature, no rank, no unit designation. Just the truth written in blood by men who measured loyalty in scars, not last names. I folded the paper along its original creases. I slid it into the breast pocket of my uniform right over my heart and buttoned the flap shut. I had my family. They just didn't share my blood. 15 years of that silence. 15 years of saving lives in classified darkness, while Captain Arthur Nelson told neighbors I answered phones on a Navy base. Every Christmas I showed up at the house in Norfolk, I sat at the far end of the table. My mother placed my plate last. My father asked David about his assignments, his promotions, his commanding officers. He asked me nothing. Not once in 15 years did he ask me what I did. Not once did he say my rank. I could have been a janitor for all he cared. One Thanksgiving about 8 years in, David brought a date. A blonde woman with a loud laugh who hung on his arm like a trophy. My father pulled out her chair. He poured her wine. He told her stories about the Nelson family military legacy, tracing the lineage back 3 generations. He pointed to the display cabinet in the living room, where David's Academy portrait sat in the center under a spotlight. He did not mention me. I sat 4 feet away eating my turkey, wearing a sweater over a body that had not slept in 40 hours because a foreign intelligence service had nearly breached the Pentagon's classified network the night before. David's date leaned toward me at one point, smiled politely, and asked what I did in the Navy. Before I could answer, David cut in with a grin. She files paperwork. The table laughed. My father laughed loudest. Every year the promotions came. Every year the clearance levels climbed. Every year the gap between who I was and who they thought I was grew wider. And every year I went back to that table in Norfolk and let them believe the lie, because the lie was my cover, and my cover was what kept the operation secure. My silence was not weakness, it was discipline. But discipline has a cost, and the cost compounds over time until it becomes a debt that someone has to pay. And all 15 years of that debt led me to this night. To that guard at the gate. To that crumpled event program. To my father's handwriting ordering my elimination from his retirement ceremony. The man had literally put my name on a kill list for a party. I was done being a ghost. Ghosts don't have clearance codes and they don't wear 3 stars. I bypassed the main checkpoint, cutting through the catering corridors that ran behind the auditorium. 15 years of intelligence work had trained me to move through spaces without disturbing them. The caterers rushing between stainless steel carts stacked with champagne glasses and silver trays of hors d'oeuvres didn't look up. The security staff at the kitchen entrance assumed I was an event coordinator because I walked with the kind of purposeful authority that discourages questions. I slipped through the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the grand auditorium and stood in the absolute darkest corner of the last row. I wore civilian clothes, a sharp black trench coat buttoned to the collar. Flat shoes with rubber soles that made no sound on the marble. I pressed my back against the cold plaster wall and took my position. The room was blindingly bright. Hundreds of white dress uniforms filled the seats, gold officer insignias catching the light from the massive crystal chandeliers overhead. Wives in cocktail dresses sat beside their husbands, pearls and diamonds glittering at their throats. Every table was draped in navy blue cloth with white centerpieces. Crystal champagne flutes clinked like tiny bells. The heavy scent of expensive floral arrangements clogged the air, a thick, suffocating perfume that was supposed to smell like elegance, but smelled like money spent to cover rot. On the main stage, the master of ceremonies adjusted his microphone. His voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, polished and practiced the voice of a man paid to make powerful people feel even more powerful. He listed my father's supposed sacrifices, his decades of service, his commitment to his family, his role as a mentor and patriarch. Every word was a carefully constructed lie, and the audience consumed it eagerly because it confirmed the story they already wanted to believe. The MC swept his hand toward the front row. David stood up on cue, his chest puffed out, his brass buttons straining against his jacket. He plastered that industrial-grade fake smile on his face, the one he had been rehearsing since he was 18. He gave a small wave, and the crowd clapped. The MC boomed. And a special tribute to all the exceptional children of Colonel Nelson. He named David. He paused. The pause hung in the air for exactly 1 beat too long, just enough for a listener to register the gap. Then the MC moved to his next paragraph. He did not say, "my name." The surgical precision of that omission cut cleaner than a scalpel. I shifted my weight in the back corner. I was invisible. A woman in a pearl necklace seated at the end of the row in front of me leaned toward her companion. She swirled her champagne, the gold liquid catching the chandelier light. She lowered her voice just enough to pretend she was being discreet, while making sure the 4 people around her could hear. "Where's Mary?" The desk clerk. Her friend scoffed, touching the back of her hair. "Probably realized she's not in her brother's league and hid." They both laughed softly, covering their mouths with manicured fingers. My jaw locked, my back teeth ground together. I did not react. An intelligence officer does not engage civilian targets. I cataloged the information and moved on. I scanned the perimeter and identified a small logistics table near the side exit, half hidden behind a folding screen. I moved to it in 3 seconds. A master guest list was taped to the mahogany surface, columns of names printed in clean black type. I ran my gloved finger down the list until I found mine. There it was. Mary Nelson. Printed neatly, just like every other name. But a thick black Sharpie line slashed through it. The ink was so heavy it bled through to the other side of the paper, a permanent scar on the document. Next to the guest list, pinned to the corkboard above the table, was a yellow sticky note. I leaned in the dim light from a nearby wall sconce, illuminating the paper. My father's heavy, aggressive penmanship. The handwriting I had spent a childhood watching on birthday cards that were always addressed primarily to David. Eliminate Mary Nelson. She must not overshadow the recognition meant for David. I pulled the note off the board. The thumbtack popped and bounced off the table. I folded the sticky note into a tiny, hard square and shoved it into my pocket alongside the crumpled event program from the gate. 2 pieces of evidence. 2 documents proving premeditated erasure. My father had not excluded me on impulse. He had planned it, written it down, distributed the instructions. This was an operation, and now I had the intelligence to dismantle it. I stepped out the side door into the sterile, brightly lit hallway. The AC blasted freezing air against the back of my neck, prickling the skin above my collar. The contrast from the overheated auditorium was jarring, like stepping from a sauna into a meat locker. I needed a clear head for the next phase. I pressed my back against the wall, planted my feet shoulder-width apart, and counted 4 breaths in, held for 4, released for 4. My pulse dropped. My vision sharpened. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me in a steady electronic hum. Just as I pivoted toward the exit, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed from the east corridor. Fast, uneven, panicked. I stepped back, instantly melting into the recess of a utility alcove. The space was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, but the shadow was deep. 2 men rounded the corner. One was a junior officer, a lieutenant, his cover tucked under his arm, his face tight with the expression of a man who didn't sign up for babysitting duty. The other was my brother. David leaned against the wall, ripping his collar open. 2 buttons popped off and skittered across the tile. His face was blotchy, deep red patches across his cheeks, and forehead soaked in sweat that ran down his temples and dripped off his jaw. He paced back and forth, 4 steps left, 4 steps right, his polished shoes squeaking violently against the tile with each turn. The junior officer reached out a hand to steady him, but David slapped it away with a sharp crack that echoed off the walls. David gripped his own hair with both fists, pulling hard enough to bend himself forward at the waist. His chest heaved. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He stared wildly at the ceiling, his eyes bulging, the veins in his neck standing out like cables. He was completely unraveling, stripped of the audience that sustained his fragile manufactured ego. David slammed his fist against the drywall. The impact left a shallow dent in the plaster, and a fine cloud of white dust floated to the floor. His voice cracked into a high-pitched hiss, a sound I had never heard from him before, the sound of a man whose mask has slipped so far it can never be put back on. If Mary shows up, everything falls apart. You don't understand. She always does this, even when she does nothing. Just her standing there with that damn cold attitude, everyone will know I'm just a copy. I can't let her steal today. She will steal everything. He slammed his palm flat against the wall again, leaving a sweaty handprint on the paint. His dress shirt was soaked through at the armpits and down the center of his back. The golden boy, the pride of the Nelson dynasty, was hyperventilating in a service hallway over the ghost of a sister he had spent his entire life mocking, belittling, and erasing. The junior officer muttered something about getting water and disappeared around the corner, his footsteps fading quickly. He wanted out. David pressed his forehead against the cold wall, his shoulders shaking. His breathing slowed fractionally, but his hands trembled at his sides. I stood 3 feet away in the dark alcove, watching every tremor, every flinch, every pathetic contraction of his collapsing ego. The fog of 15 years evaporated in that hallway. Instantly. Completely. Like a window wiped clean with a single stroke. They didn't hate me because I was a failure. They hated me because they were cowards. My father had not excluded me from that ceremony because he was indifferent. He excluded me because my existence was a threat to the lie he had built. David had not spent a lifetime mocking me because he believed I was beneath him. He mocked me because he knew in the deepest, most terrified chamber of his brain that I was an apex predator. And he was desperate to keep me in a cage because the moment I stepped out, their entire hierarchy collapsed. David's hallway breakdown was not a confession, it was a deposition. And I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. I stepped backward out of the alcove without making a sound. My pulse steadied into a lethal rhythmic beat, the same cadence I maintained during live operations. I was done hiding in shadows. I was done being a ghost that haunted hallways. I was going to walk through the front door of my father's empire and burn it to the ground with the truth. If you have ever been treated like a shadow in your own family while carrying their weight, please like this video and share your story in the comments. We do not fight alone, and the reckoning I prepared for my brother was about to shatter his fake reality. I pushed through the heavy steel exit doors of the building, letting the biting Virginia wind hit my face. The parking lot stretched out ahead of me, half empty under the yellow sodium lights. The asphalt was damp. The cold cut through the trench coat and stung the skin on my hands. I walked with purpose across the lot to my heavily armored black SUV parked in the far corner, away from every camera, away from every window, positioned at an angle that allowed a clear exit onto the main road. I unlocked it with the key fob. The lights flashed once. I opened the rear door and slid into the back seat. The heavy tint of the ballistic glass sealed me off from the world. The interior smelled like leather and gun oil. I reached across the seat for the thick canvas garment bag laid perfectly flat on the bench, exactly where I had placed it that morning, knowing this night would come. Inside that auditorium, the ceremony was still grinding forward. The MC was droning through my father's career highlights, reading from a script that had been scrubbed of my existence. David was probably back in his seat by now, mopping his face with a napkin, rebuilding that plastic grin one muscle at a time. My father was sitting in the front row, his posture rigid, his chin high, accepting praise for a legacy built on the systematic erasure of his own daughter. They had no idea what was parked 200 yards away in the dark corner of the lot. They had no idea that the woman they had tried to eliminate from the guest list was sitting in the back of a vehicle with enough authority to reclassify every secret in the building. I stripped off the civilian trench coat, folding it with mechanical precision, creasing the fabric along the original lines. I set it on the passenger seat. I unzipped the garment bag with a sharp, decisive pull. The zipper teeth separated with a metallic hiss that filled the silent cabin. Inside, laid out on a form-fitting frame, was the pristine, blinding white dress uniform of a United States naval flag officer. The fabric was heavy, starched to a razor-sharp crease along the trousers, the jacket so stiff it held its own shape without a hanger. I slid my arms into the jacket sleeves, feeling the weight of the material settle onto my shoulders like plate armor. I buttoned each brass button with surgical precision, bottom to top, each one clicking into its fastener with a satisfying snap. I snapped the high collar into place, feeling the stiff edge press against my throat. I reached into the velvet-lined box resting on the leather console. I opened the lid. 3 silver stars sat pinned to a foam insert, gleaming even in the low light filtering through the tinted glass. Each star represented 5 years of classified service. Each star was a campaign won in rooms my father didn't have the clearance to know existed. I extracted the heavy gold-laced hard shoulder boards from the box, the 3 silver-embroidered stars gleaming in the low light. I slid them perfectly onto the epaulets of my uniform, locking them in. Left shoulder. Right shoulder. The weight was real, physical, undeniable. The metal was cold against my fingers. My encrypted tactical phone buzzed violently against the leather console, the vibration so strong it skittered an inch across the surface. I picked it up. A Priority 1 message from the Pentagon High Command flashed in stark green text against the black screen. "We know Colonel Nelson crossed your name off. Walk in there. Your presence carries the honor of this entire system, not just his." I read the message twice. I locked the screen. The highest authorities in the United States military, men and women who commanded carrier strike groups and directed the defense posture of the entire nation, were authorizing me to break 15 years of undercover protocol. This was not personal revenge. This was institutional correction. The system was telling me that what my father did was not just a family insult. It was a violation of the honor structure that held the entire Navy together. I looked into the rearview mirror. The quiet, compliant daughter my father tried to erase was dead. She had died somewhere between that backyard barbecue and the 34th hour of Operation Iron Shield. The woman staring back at me had spent 15 years commanding intelligence operations that shaped the security posture of the entire Pacific Theater. Her eyes were steady. Her jaw was set. Her uniform was flawless. I secured my white cover on my head, adjusting the brim exactly 2 fingers above my brow, per regulation. The gold insignia on the brim caught the overhead light. I opened the heavy door of the SUV. My combat boots hit the pavement with a solid crack that echoed off the concrete barriers of the parking structure. I did not walk back toward the side entrance. I did not sneak through the catering corridor. I slammed the door shut and marched directly toward the massive main double doors of the grand auditorium, my stride measured at exactly 30 inches per step. My spine locked vertical, my 3 stars catching every overhead light like a signal fire cutting through fog. I stood before the towering oak doors of the auditorium. They were 10 feet tall, solid paneled, the wood dark and heavy. Inside, I could hear the muffled drone of the master of ceremonies, his voice rising and falling in practiced cadence. The bass notes of polite, rehearsed laughter rumbled through the frame. I placed both hands on the heavy brass handles. The metal was ice cold against my palms. I did not gently push. I did not ease them open. I shoved both doors with a violent concussive force that used every pound of weight behind my shoulders. The hinges screamed. A sharp metallic shriek tore through the auditorium and severed the MC's sentence mid-syllable. The sound was not subtle. It was designed not to be. I stepped onto the red carpet. My boots struck the marble beneath it. Crack, crack, crack. Each footfall was a controlled detonation in the silence. The carpet muffled nothing. The marble amplified everything. 500 heads snapped toward the back of the room in a single wave, like a field of grass hit by a gust of wind. The initial annoyance on the faces of the officers' wives, the irritation of having a ceremony interrupted, morphed instantly into something else entirely. Their eyes locked onto the 3 massive silver stars gleaming on my shoulders. Jaws dropped. Champagne glasses froze halfway to painted lips. Napkins crumpled in white-knuckled fists. The color drained from face after face as the realization cascaded through the rows like a shockwave. A collective gasp sucked the oxygen from the room, a physical vacuum that I could feel against my skin. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, fixed on the stage. I did not look left. I did not look right. I did not scan the crowd for familiar faces. I gave them nothing but the unshakable authority of my forward momentum. The center aisle stretched out before me like a runway, and I marched down it with the terrifying composure of a warhead locked on target. I reached the halfway point of the aisle. To my left in the VIP section, a massive man in a dress uniform suddenly shoved his chair backward. The legs screeched against the hardwood and the sound ripped through the silence. He was 6'4", 240 pounds of dense muscle packed into a jacket that barely contained his shoulders. A jagged scar ran down his left cheek from temple to jaw, a souvenir from a firefight I had navigated him out of 6 years ago during Operation Silent Echo. I had been the voice in his earpiece. I had been the one who found the gap in the enemy perimeter and guided his team through it meter by meter. He was alive because of a satellite frequency I had opened with bleeding fingers. The SEAL commander locked his eyes onto mine. The recognition was instantaneous. Something ignited behind his pupils, something that looked like fanatical reverence. He inflated his massive chest, squaring his shoulders until his jacket seams groaned. He drew a breath that expanded his ribcage by 3 inches. His voice erupted like a mortar shell, detonating inside the enclosed hall, a sound so deep and so loud that it physically shook the air. Admiral Nelson to the front line. The command acted as a tripwire. 300 United States Navy SEALs scattered throughout the auditorium in dress uniforms and civilian suits, at back tables and side rows, and VIP seats, violently exploded from their chairs in absolute unison. The deafening crash of 300 wooden chairs slamming backward into the hardwood floorboards hit the room like a shockwave. The crystal chandeliers above swayed on their chains. Glass pendants rattled and clinked against each other, filling the air with a sharp, tinkling sound that undercut the thunder. The vibration traveled through the marble floor and into the souls of every person still sitting in their seat. 300 men snapped to rigid attention, their boot heels cracking together with the precision of a single rifle shot. 300 right hands snapped to their brows in a flawless salute, arms locked at 45 degrees, fingers pressed together, every line straight, every angle exact. The room shook. The acoustic impact was physical. Women clutched their husbands' arms. Men gripped the edges of their tables with both hands. A champagne glass toppled off a table and shattered on the floor, and nobody flinched because the sound was nothing compared to the thunder of 300 warriors declaring allegiance to the woman the entire room had been told was a desk clerk. I did not break stride. I did not slow down. I did not acknowledge the salute. I kept marching, each boot strike splitting the silence like an axe through dry wood until I reached the front of the auditorium. I marched past the front row. The SEALs held their rigid salute, 300 arms forming an impenetrable corridor of respect. On the main stage, the master of ceremonies stared at my shoulder boards. His jaw went slack. The script he had been reading from slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor like a wounded bird. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy steel microphone slipped through his slick fingers, plummeting to the wooden stage. It hit the floorboards with a deafening thud, and the impact drove the mic's head into the wood at an angle that sent a piercing, high-pitched screech of feedback through the massive speaker system. The sound wailed across the auditorium like an air raid siren, shredding the last remnant of the ceremony's rehearsed dignity. The MC staggered backward, knocking his notes off the podium, and retreated to the far side of the stage. I stopped at the base of the stage and locked eyes with my father. Captain Arthur Nelson, the undisputed dictator of my childhood, the architect of my erasure, the man who had handwritten the order to eliminate me from his guest list, was completely paralyzed. He had just raised a crystal flute of champagne for his toast. His arm froze in midair, elbow-bent glass, tilted at an absurd angle. His eyes bulged, tracking the 3 silver stars on my uniform. I watched him count them. Once, twice, a third time, as if repetition might reduce the number. All the blood drained from his face in a visible wave from forehead to chin, leaving him the color of old cement. His hand trembled so violently that champagne sloshed over the rim of the glass, splashing down his pristine dress trousers in a dark spreading stain that crept down his thigh. He opened his mouth. His lips moved. No sound came out. The man who had spent 40 years commanding rooms with his voice could not produce a single syllable. The man who had written "Eliminate Mary Nelson" was staring at a 3-star admiral and realizing in agonizing real time that he had tried to erase someone who outranked every officer in the building. 2 feet from my father, David was undergoing a total psychological collapse. The color left his face in a wave forehead to chin, identical to our father's, but faster, more violent, as if someone had ripped a plug. His knees buckled. He stumbled backward, his hands desperately clawing at the polished edge of the podium to keep himself upright. His fingers slipped on the lacquered wood. His legs gave out further, and he caught himself at the last second hunching over the podium like a man who had been gut-punched. His mask of arrogant superiority melted away. In its place was the exact same hyperventilating panic I had witnessed in the hallway. His chest heaved. His eyes darted around the room in wild, frantic arcs, searching for an exit, an ally, a script, anyone who could tell him what to do. Nobody moved. Nobody helped. He dropped his head, his chin touching his chest. He was completely unable to look at the blazing aura of authority radiating from the sister he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. I did not yell. I did not demand an apology. I did not deliver a speech. I reached up with my right hand and adjusted the brim of my cover. 1 fraction of an inch. The gesture was so casual, so practiced, so indifferent that it communicated everything a speech could not. It said I was comfortable. It said I was in no hurry. It said their pain was beneath my notice. I stood there, an immovable monolith of naval authority, letting the heavy, crushing silence do the work. 500 people watched the great Colonel Nelson and his golden boy disintegrate into pathetic, trembling shells. I had dismantled a 30-year dynasty of abuse without firing a single shot, without raising my voice, without breaking my stride. I used nothing but the gravity of my own existence. The room remained locked in absolute paralysis. The seals held their salute. Nobody breathed. I turned sharply away from the stage, my boots grinding against the marble with a controlled pivot. I identified a vacant seat at the absolute center of the VIP front row. The chair was upholstered in navy blue velvet. It had been reserved for someone who never showed up, or perhaps someone who had been eliminated from the seating chart. I stepped toward it, grabbed the backrest and pulled it out with a loud scrape that echoed through the silent room like a blade drawn from its sheath. I sat down. I removed my cover and placed it squarely on my lap brim, facing forward. My spine was straight. My hands rested on my thighs. That single act of sitting was the tactical signal. The seals dropped their salutes in perfect unison. 300 arms snapped to their sides with one final thunderous crack that shook the chandelier crystals one last time. Then they sat. 300 chairs hitting the floor in a controlled wave like the closing of a massive gate. The power dynamic in the room inverted instantly. A vice admiral, the 3-star fleet commander my father had spent his entire career trying to impress, the man whose approval my father would have traded his firstborn for, stood up from his table in the far corner. He buttoned his jacket with one hand as he rose. He did not look at the stage. He did not glance at my father. He did not acknowledge David. He walked directly toward me, his shoes clicking on the marble with the deliberate cadence of a man who knows exactly where power sits. He stopped in front of my chair. I stood to meet him. He extended his hand, and his calloused grip closed around mine with the crushing strength of absolute respect. He held it. His deep voice boomed through the quiet hall, projected clearly enough for every single person in the room to hear without amplification. Admiral Nelson, it's an honor to finally meet the person behind Operation Iron Shield in the flesh. Without you, the Navy would have lost thousands of its finest. He held my hand for a long moment, his eyes locked on mine. Then the applause came. It didn't start politely. It didn't build gradually. It erupted. A roaring, furious wave of genuine reverence that crashed through the auditorium from back to front. This was not the rehearsed obligatory clapping the audience had given my father all evening. This was the sound of 500 people realizing they had been lied to, and that the truth was standing right in front of them in a white uniform with 3 stars on each shoulder. Officers stood. Their wives stood. The catering staff in the back stood. The sound shook the walls and rattled the champagne flutes on every table. I stood as the ceremony formally collapsed. The MC did not return to the podium. The script was abandoned on the stage floor. The event transformed into a chaotic reception centered entirely around me. Senior officers formed a line to introduce themselves. A captain from Naval Intelligence gripped my hand and told me his entire unit had studied my countermeasure protocols as training material for 3 years. A vice admiral from Pacific Command said she had recommended me for a classified commendation that I would never be able to display publicly. Intelligence officials who had worked under my directives for years without ever seeing my face finally had a name and a body to attach to the operations that had shaped their careers. They shook my hand with both of theirs gripping hard, holding on for too long, saying things like, "It was an honor," and "We always wondered who you were." The SEAL commander from Operation Silent Echo stood beside me like a bodyguard, his scarred face beaming with the pride of a man whose debt has been publicly acknowledged. My father retreated into the shadows at the far edge of the stage. Nobody followed him. Nobody asked him to come back to the center. Nobody raised a glass for the man whose retirement had been the purpose of the entire evening. He stood alone in the dark pocket behind the curtain, still clutching his champagne glass with both hands, the stain on his trousers dark and spreading. His face was gray. His lips were pressed into a thin, bloodless line. He watched the room orbit around his daughter with the expression of a man watching his own house burn down while standing on the lawn in his slippers. He had spent 30 years building a dynasty of noise and optics, and in under 5 minutes, a woman he had tried to delete from a guest list had turned his kingdom into her reception hall. The irony was not lost on a single person in that room. My mother sat frozen at her table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes darting between my father in the shadows and me in the light. She did not get up. She did not choose a side. She did the only thing she had ever been capable of doing. She sat still and waited for someone else to tell her what to do. David staggered down the stage steps. His movements were clumsy, uncoordinated, like a man wading through deep water. His hands hung loose at his sides. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, frantic. The junior officer from the hallway was nowhere in sight. Nobody was coming to prop David up. Nobody was going to hand him a glass of water and tell him it was okay. He stopped 2 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip, close enough to smell the alcohol and adrenaline seeping from his pores. His voice came out broken, stripped raw, all the bravado boiled away, until there was nothing left but a trembling man asking a trembling question. How long have you hidden this? I turned slowly. I looked down at the officer who had spent his entire life trying to make me feel small. His shoulders were hunched. His chin was low. His fingers twitched at his sides. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of pity. I did not soften my eyes. I looked him dead in his terrified, red-rimmed gaze and delivered the final fatal strike. One word. One number. 15 years. The number hit him like a sledgehammer to the center of his chest. David physically recoiled. His head snapped back. He clutched his jacket over his heart, his fingers twisting the fabric into a knot. His mouth opened and closed, but there was nothing left to say. 15 years. The entire span of his fraudulent career. Every Thanksgiving insult, every desk clerk joke, every barbecue toast. Every time he had stood in front of a mirror and told himself he was the pride of the Nelson family. All of it was built on a foundation of absolute catastrophic ignorance. He turned away. His legs barely held him. He disappeared into the thinning crowd and nobody followed him. Nobody called his name. Nobody cared. 6 months later, I walked into the foyer of the Nelson family home in Norfolk. The front door was unlocked. The house was quiet, stripped of its usual noise. No rock music from the living room. No David holding court at the kitchen counter with a beer in his hand. No booming laughter from my father in his study. The air smelled like furniture polish and roast beef. I stopped in front of the large glass display cabinet in the living room. I had stood in front of this cabinet hundreds of times as a child looking at the relics of Nelson family glory. David's Academy portrait had occupied the dead center for 20 years, a massive framed photo of him in his dress. White's chin-up, jaw-clenched eyes blazing with manufactured confidence. That photo had been shoved to the far left corner, almost hidden behind a stack of books that looked deliberately placed to obscure it. In the absolute dead center of the cabinet, sitting on a velvet cushion under a small spotlight, my mother had clearly installed herself, drilled the hole, and threaded the wire was my Navy Distinguished Service Medal. The brass gleamed under the focused beam. The ribbon was perfectly pressed. The citation card sat beside it in a small acrylic stand. They were worshipping the power they had once tried to erase. The cabinet told the whole story. My family did not operate on love. They operated on leverage. And now the leverage had shifted permanently. I took my seat at the head of the dining table. Nobody questioned it. Nobody gestured toward a different chair. Nobody suggested that the head of the table was my father's seat. It was mine now. My father sat to my right. His shoulders were rounded in a way I had never seen before, curled inward as if his body was trying to make itself smaller. He did not boast about his past deployments. He did not tell war stories. He did not fill the silence with his voice. He cleared his throat, keeping his eyes lowered to his water glass, and quietly asked me for my analysis on the shifting geopolitical tensions in the Pacific. His jaw clenched once before the question came out, a brief flicker of something old and bitter, the last ember of the dictator's pride dying behind his teeth. He swallowed it. I gave him a brief tactical response. He nodded vigorously, absorbing every word with the posture of a student addressing a professor. My mother hurried out of the kitchen, her slippers scuffing the tile. She bypassed David, completely walking past his chair without even glancing at him, and placed the first serving of roast beef squarely onto my plate. She poured my water first. She asked me with a careful, eager softness in her voice if I needed anything else before she sat down. David sat at the far end of the table, the seat that used to be mine. He did not speak. He did not make eye contact. He did not tell stories about his base, his drills, his men, his career. He kept his head bowed over his plate, cutting his food into small pieces with slow mechanical movements. His fork paused for one single second when I spoke a tiny hitch in his rhythm, then resumed. The golden boy had been completely neutralized. His ego had not recovered. It would not recover. They were all tiptoeing around me, terrified of the 3-star admiral they had accidentally forged by trying to destroy a 17-year-old girl holding a framed certificate on a patio. I ate my dinner in silence, tasting nothing, feeling nothing for the 3 strangers sitting at the table with me. They were not my family. My family wrote messages on blood-stained paper and slid them under doors without asking for credit. I laid my napkin on the table, folding it once, placing it beside my plate, with the same precision I used to fold classified documents. I stood up without asking to be excused, without complimenting the food, without promising to visit again, without giving them a date for my next appearance. My chair scraped against the tile. The sound made all 3 of them flinch. I walked through the living room. I passed the display cabinet with my medal under its little spotlight, the brass catching the light as I moved past it. I passed the wall of family photos where my face had only recently been rehung. The frame was new. The nail was shiny. They had clearly gone to the store, bought a fresh frame, printed a new photo, and hammered it into the wall sometime in the last 6 months. 20 years of absence on that wall corrected in an afternoon, as if the erasure had never happened. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cold and clean against my face. The street was dark and quiet. Crickets pulsed somewhere in the hedge. I pulled the door shut behind me without looking back. I did not slam it. I closed it with the same controlled, measured force I applied to everything. I walked down the 3 concrete steps across the cracked driveway and climbed into my SUV. The leather seat was cold against the back of my legs. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands, feeling the cold rubber press against my palms. I turned the ignition and the heavy engine roared to life, vibrating through the frame and into my bones. I pulled out of the driveway and onto the dark street, my headlights cutting a white path through the black. I drove slowly, watching the Nelson family home shrink in my rearview mirror. The porch light stayed on behind me. I watched it get smaller and smaller until it was just a pinprick of yellow in the glass, and then it was gone. I reached into my breast pocket, feeling for the piece of blood-stained tactical paper that I still carried over my heart. It was there, soft from years of body heat and wear. The handwriting had faded, but the words hadn't. "We are alive because of you. A soldier never betrays their benefactor." I buttoned the pocket shut and put both hands back on the wheel. I didn't need their submission, and I didn't need their love. I was a Vice Admiral of the United States Navy. I had saved 5,000 lives in a bunker at hour 34. I had opened a satellite frequency with bleeding fingers to pull 12 men out of the dark. I had 300 warriors who would stand up in a crowded room and shake the chandeliers for me. I had forged my own empire in the silence they tried to bury me in, and I had built it so high that when I finally stepped into the light, the shadow I cast swallowed everything they had ever pretended to be. The house disappeared into the darkness behind me. I kept driving. You do not need a toxic family's permission to be great, so please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment if you are building your own empire in silence. A true soldier never begs for a seat at the table when they own the entire building.